pleased to be able to be talking about a topic that's very timely and probably affecting all of us at some level throughout the year. But first, before we get started talking about PRRS, I just want to take a chance to introduce you to Suidae. We are a full-service swine consulting practice. We're originally located in Algona, Iowa in 1998, and we've since added 3 additional locations to better service our clients. I am located in Albert Lea, Minnesota. We don't have a physical location there, but I'm there. So, Suidae is a service company. Besides veterinary services, we also offer management services, research, laboratory, and product procurement services. I think we're a little unique in the fact that our client source is predominantly small and mid-sized producers, anywhere from 1,000 to 12,000 sows. And at the end of the day, our goal as owners and employees of the company is to provide the best customer service we can. We're a service business, and so that's something we're always striving for. So PRRS, we're in Iowa, and I think it's probably safe to say that Iowans know PRRS better than most anybody else. And it's because we're the #1 hog producing state. We've got a lot of Gruel-finished pigs in this state, and PRRS is ever-present issue. And with that, we tend to be able to be really good at blaming PRRS for everything. So every time it seems like we get a group of pigs that we know is going to be PRRS positive, you just kind of hang your head and, well, this is going to be a tough road, and sometimes we tend to give up a little easy. So I'm not asking you to get excited about PRRS today, but I am saying that we don't have to give up. We have some tools and information that we can use to try to reduce the impact that it makes on our farm. So PRRS virus is intolerable today. PRRS is not something that we can just live with and expect to survive in today's industry. There are things now that we can do over years of trial and error that we can say we can consistently and predictably eradicate the virus from at least farms and flows. And then we also have technology that's existed for a decade now that can help us to reduce our risk of a new virus introduction. And I'm basically talking about filtration there. Whether or not you have sows or Gruel-finished pigs or both, I think the #1 goal for everybody is to produce a negative weaned pig, a PRRS negative weaned pig. And not just at weaning, but 3 weeks later, or have that pig maintain its negative status. So you should be able to go into a nursery or a Gruel-finished barn 3 weeks after a pig is placed, and if it's truly coming from a PRRS negative farm, you should be able to oral fluid sample that group, and they should remain negative. So the definition of a negative pig is that that pig will not seroconvert from the sow farm strain at any point during its growing phase. So I think that's important that our expectation of what a negative pig is extends into the Gruel-finish period. I think it's also important that we know your source. There's, whether or not you have a relationship with a sow farm or you own the sow farm, you need to have constant contact with the sow farm, know what their status is, know what their testing methods are to make sure over time that if anything changes in the PRRS status that you're aware of it. I can't stress enough the importance of vet-to-vets. So if you're buying pigs on the open market or getting ready to sign a contract with someone, if you don't have ownership in the sow farm, it's so valuable to just call your vet up and ask them to contact the vet of the source farm and just talk to them. The term triple negative is a great term. It's so loosely used, and there's no value in that term for me at all. So I've got clients that say, well, there's no reason, to have you check into it. They're triple negative. And even though the ASV does have criteria that's been published as to what a negative pig is classified as, there's still a wide difference. And I always find it interesting between veterinarians and producers what is really a negative pig and how they classify that. So it's important to get your vet involved so that you can properly prepare yourself for whatever pig is coming to your door. Internal PRRS infections, again, sow herd stability is measured by downstream performance. If your sow farm is producing really well, that's great. That makes everybody feel good. But if the pig falls apart after it's weaned, it means nothing. So again, we're in this together, and if the pig looks great on the sow farm, it's got to look great in Gruel-finish, or everybody loses, because nobody wants a PRRS positive pig today. So here is some data from Dr. Linhares and some of his colleagues that did a study. And when I talk about we know today how to predictably and successfully eradicate PRRS virus from herds, It's with the method of herd closure. And the definition of herd closure is that there are no gilt or other animal introductions into the herd for a set period of time. And what's really important is how long that set period of time is. So in this study, they looked at 61 herds and followed them over their time of herd closure, and they looked at how long it took them to produce negative pigs. So the definition of negative pigs here was the ASV categorization of negative, which would be several tests occurring over a 90-day period, and if they were negative over that 90-day period, they were considered negative. So in this study, of the 61 herds, at 200 days, only about 60% of them were actually negative consistently. The ones that followed it out and went longer, out to 250, 300 days, those had a much higher chance of success. And so we've learned over the years that no longer is 200 days enough to feel really confident that you're going to be successful. You will be 60% of the time about, according to the study. But if you really want to follow it out and you really want to know that it's worth the effort, you need to commit to the full 240 plus day herd closure, which it's hard to do. You need to also minimize external risks, and one of those external risks that we have had trouble controlling in the past has been aerosol. And we still have trouble controlling that today, but it's more controllable with filtration. And I have a question mark behind that because that is not for everybody. And I think the biggest thing with filtration is where your farm is located. If your farm is located in a hog-dense area where you're experiencing breaks on a regular basis, I would argue that you may not be able to afford not to filter. And so that's something that I think definitely has to be looked at as a control method, especially in high pig dense areas. Filtration, economically, if you can prevent one PRRS break, you can pay for the project. And now that we've had a decade or more of this technology, I think that we can no longer argue with the fact that filtration does reduce the break rate on farms. It doesn't eliminate it, and I think it's important to manage that expectation. But it does reduce it, and that's been proven over several data sets in the past decade. So one of the data sets I included here is from Alonso et al. 2013, and he looked at 20 sow farms over 7 years. Those 20 sow farms prior to filtration had about a 0.75 break rate per year. After they filtered, the break rate was reduced to a 0.06 to 0.22 break rate based upon how they classified if the PRRS was a new break or not. That's why there's a range there. But in the end, there was an 80% reduction in PRRS breaks after filtration, and that's pretty significant. That's impressive. And I think that can be repeated over other data sets as well. It's in the 80s for percent of time or percent of reduction of PRRS breaks. So there aren't many low-risk areas around here. So when I talk about here, I'm talking about Iowa and southern Minnesota. And sometimes I'll talk to clients in Iowa and they say, well, we're in a fairly low-risk area. And really, I would consider the entire state high risk. Dr. Polieski did a study in 2011 where he tested finishing pigs at the end of their finishing stage prior to market by pulling blood and looking at ELISA titers. And if those animals had negative ELISA titers, then they had never been exposed to PRRS throughout their growing phase. And what he found was he looked at farms in Iowa that were both north of US Highway 30 and south of US Highway 30 and split them up by their PRRS status so that he looked at whether or not they were positive by ELISA at marketing. And he found that 45% of them were positive. Then he split those same subset of farms by I-35 and their relationship to I-35. So he looked at how many of those farms were west and how many were east. And the ultimate result of that was that there was no significant difference between the location in relationship to US Highway 30 or I-35. So he found that overall, regardless of where you're located in the state of Iowa, you have a 35 to 50% chance of breaking with PRRS at some time during the growing phase. And that's if you place negative pigs in Iowa on vaccinated pigs, that they will 35 to 50% of the time they will go positive during the growing phase. So knowing that information, there's some considerations to be made. And one of them is the use of modified live vaccine. So I think we'll all stand up here today and say there's no silver bullet. I wish I had it. That'd be a great presentation. But unfortunately today we just have tools. And one of them is modified live vaccine. And just like with filtration, I think it's important to manage expectations of what that vaccine is meant to do. So that vaccine is not meant to prevent PRRS breaks. What it is meant to do is to mitigate the results if you do end up breaking with PRRS. And that's largely measured by reduction in mortality and increase in average daily gain over control pigs when PRRS does when PRRS does come into factor. So there's several vaccines on the market. They're all good vaccines. The biggest thing I'd say there, the biggest consideration is timing of administration. So you want to get the vaccine in ideally 4 weeks prior to when the pigs are going to be exposed to PRRS, 2 weeks minimum. But 4 weeks really is what the immune system needs to be able to be prepared when that pig sees PRRS to provide an immune response. If the sow farm source is unstable, then timing maybe needs to be even earlier than weaning. And when I say unstable, when we have PRRS farms that are unstable, there's typically a % of the population in farrowing that's negative, and there's a % of litters that are positive. And if they're following good, strict McRebel and not cross-fostering litters, the negative litters will remain negative until weaning. And so their point of exposure to PRRS will be at weaning. So if you kind of back your strategy up on vaccination, if you vaccinate them at processing, you'll have 2 to 3 weeks where that vaccine has been given and kicked in the pig, and when that pig is weaned, they'll have a little more chance of being protected when they meet up with their positive cohorts. If your sow farm source is stable and you're just looking at controlling PRRS once the pig gets placed in your sow or in your grow finish facility, then really giving the vaccine at your convenience it's up to you. I typically tell people the earlier the better. So if you can let that pig get acclimated to the environment, maybe not do it right off the truck, but wait and let them get acclimated for a day or two and then give it, that's probably the best time to give it. So every pig weaned in Iowa and southern Minnesota, again, we talked about how they have a 35 to 50% chance of getting exposed to a new strain of PRRS. And this is just an example of a client that we work with. This is a graph showing finisher mortality. So each line or each bar on that graph is a closeout. And finishing mortality is on the left side on the axis there. And so you can see pretty clearly the finishing mortality was running, average of about 5.8% or just under 6%. They implemented PRRS vaccine and were able to drop that finishing mortality by 2%. And I don't think that's unusual. I think that's pretty repeatable in the data that I've seen. So other considerations with PRRS are antibiotic use. So even though we're dealing with a virus, there is a strategic antibiotic use that can help us out. So those would be to control secondary bacterial diseases that are commonly seen in PRRS cases. So that'd be your strep suis, your Haemophilus parasuis, A. suis. Recognize that with PRRS pigs, there's typically 2 to 3 waves of fallouts, and so you may need to pulse medication strategically rather than just using it once. Draxin and Palmitil are products that I go towards pretty frequently when we have PRRS breaks. Those are both macrolide antibiotics. They're in the macrolide class. Macrolides work by inhibiting virus replication in the macrophage, in the porcine macrophage. PRRS has an affinity for the macrophage. And so there is some belief, because of the mechanism of action of these two products, the macrolides, that they may have some antiviral properties in addition to their antibacterial properties. So I always recommend Draxin at weaning, and then follow that with Palmitil 10 days post-weaning, which is available both in water and feed. And the water form is nice because it's just a little easier to manage. And there's a generic Palmitil on the market too, but that class of antibiotics I think is valuable for use in PRRS situations. When you have PRRS or you have pigs at risk of getting PRRS, I think the pig flow is key. So of course, you've heard this many times, all-in, all-out production is preferred because large sites that are continuous flow in Iowa are hard to manage. So if you think again about that statistic with the percent of pigs, 35 to 50% get PRRS at some time during their growing phase. If you have a continuous flow site, it's a matter of time before a group of pigs on that site gets exposed to PRRS. And then what happens is you feed that PRRS a new pig population every so often, and you perpetuate disease. And unless you break that cycle by doing a depop, repop, that's going to be something you're going to constantly battle. If you have nursery and finisher sites versus wean-to-finish sites, you need to manage transport biosecurity, because that's another big area where you could have some PRRS risk if you're hauling pigs and you're not paying attention to transport biosecurity. So again, with PRRS, positive attitude is always the hardest thing, I think, and convincing people that we don't have to put up with poor production. If things happen like sudden death loss, you need to call a vet and not just think it's PRRS and there's nothing we can do, because there are things we can do. It's not a death sentence, but it does require a lot of personal effort, more so than any other time. And we always say that you can really tell who the caretakers are that are really good caretakers, not in the good times, but in the bad times when they're required to really work hard to try to raise a pig. So if the pigs are very sick, another consideration you may need to make is alter your vaccination protocol. So if you have scheduled to oral vaccinate the pigs, or to vaccinate them with maybe a booster dose of circummyco vaccine, if the pigs are sick enough, you may want to consider moving or changing the timing of that vaccination, because we know that sick pigs tend to handle vaccine a little worse, just like we do, and so your efficacy of that vaccine could be extremely reduced if you vaccinate in the face of a severe PRRS break. So my favorite, I call this the rainbow pig syndrome, is going into nurseries and seeing pigs that have multiple marks on them. And it's the caretaker hoping and praying that maybe one more shot will be what it takes to get that pig to come around. And I always tell caretakers that, we really need to consider when we're dealing with PRRS pigs when enough is enough. And that's a really hard call to make. But it's necessary, one, for a welfare reason, and secondly, because that pig is shedding virus probably at higher levels than other pigs, and it probably is not doing you any good in the barn. So, and surely do not vaccinate that pig, because I've seen people vaccinate that pig when it probably should have been euthanized several days prior. So those are just things to consider. Timely euthanasia, again, chronic fading pigs that are unresponsive to treatment. And then keep in mind, if you're a nursery that's going to be transporting pigs to another grower at the end of the nursery phase, that you grade those pigs and make sure that nothing that is unfit for transport doesn't leave your barn, because the likelihood of recovery of those pigs is low if you send pigs that are compromised or chronic, and then the person on the other end of the line has to take care of them. Recognizing fallouts early is important, and with PRRS it's even more important. Sick pigs don't eat or drink very well, so this would require the use of a syringe. It's important that you find them early and give them a shot. The earlier you find them, the better off you are, and the more likely that the treatment's going to be successful. So here's a pig that has no bulge in its belly. That's an early fallout. There's several pigs here that I just have pointed out as pigs that you need to look at. I always tell people this requires getting in the pen, and it requires running every pig by you. And so my rule of thumb is if the pig makes you do a double take, you need to treat it. And that's early identification. So you may, if the pig runs by you and you find it again, treat it. Because the earlier and the more effort you put in up front, the better off you're going to be. And it won't always be that intense. It's just that first few weeks. Organizing the barn, some concepts to consider are that small pigs get along better with other small pigs, but I always say there's a caveat there. Being small is not a disease. So just because the pig is small doesn't mean that you need to baby it or spend more time with it. It's good to get them away from other pigs where they may be competing, and maybe get on a or a feeder that they can get a little extra starter pellet, but otherwise, let them be. The less time you move pigs, the better. When you move pigs, that allows you to focus on the high maintenance or high risk population. And most pigs, if they haven't learned to eat by day 4 or 5, there still might be some hope. But if they haven't learned to eat by about 7 to 10 days, they're never going to. The best place for a sick pen, again, is in the center of the barn where there's less temperature fluctuations. My philosophy on sick pens is that when we add new pigs to a sick pen every day, you disrupt their social structure. So I typically like to see people set aside a couple empty pens if you have the luxury to do that in your facility, and do a pull down as a group rather than individual pigs. And then as that group goes on a couple days, then you do another pull down as a group to keep them kind of together. Mat feeding is a good practice. You should be doing this about 4 times per day for the first 7 days. This reduces the number of fallout pigs, and it also stimulates them to come and eat, similar to that of a lactating sow. If you use too much, it becomes bedding, and that top right picture is kind of an example of that. So less feed is better, and if you do it more often, that's even better too. You can get creative with this. You don't have to use mats, but you can use the feed. You can put the feed on a line where the 2 slat gangs meet, and it's amazing to see how these pigs will run to that and eat that as a group. And there's just a pig that's fallen out there in the picture. You can recognize pigs that don't get up and come to the plate. Gruel feeding, quickly, 4 times per day is what I recommend for gruel feeding, and you should focus on the sort or fallout pens. This reduces fallout pigs as well, and when you do this, it's important to make sure your consistency is correct. So less feed, more water. They should consume it within 90 minutes, and again, a pig that doesn't eat within 7 days probably never will. The biggest mistake I see is people who get over aggressive with gruel feeding, or using like Ultra Care gel or something like that, is they overfeed it, and then the pigs, you can actually create a problem with the pigs waiting for you every day to feed them, and our goal is always to get that pig to go to the feeder, not to wait for us to gruel feed or give them some other sweet additive. So here's gruel mixing guidelines. Again, the take home here is less feed, more water, and as time goes on, you gradually reduce the water and increase the feed. Again, you're always just trying to get them to eat it and get to the feeder. Brooder heater management. It's important to provide supplemental heat to pigs in the first 7 to 14 days. You should control the temperature settings. I would just recommend to you that you look at the manual that comes with your brooder heaters. It'll tell you how many pigs it should cover, what height they should be set at, and all that information is available to you. So in conclusion, be sure that you have minimized risks from the sow farm. That's the #1 place to start when you're trying to reduce the effects of PRRS on your farm, is to obtain a negative weaned pig. Modified live PRRS vaccine does work. There is a return on investment there, unless you don't break with PRRS. If you break with PRRS on those pigs and they're vaccinated, it's anywhere from probably conservatively like a $4 to $6 return on investment. Antibiotic use can help with secondary diseases. Pig flow strategies, all in, all out, is preferred. And then remember to keep a positive attitude, because we don't have to let this be a complete disaster every time we get PRRS pigs.